Welcome to EHP. I want you to picture something. It's 1971, and a literal French warship sails right into New York Harbor.
Yeah, and to be clear, this was definitely not a diplomatic photo op or a friendly visit.
Right, not at all. It was actually there on direct orders from the French president to physically collect his nation's gold, like directly from the vaults of the American financial system.
Because the French government had, they had basically done the math, and they realized that the American dollar, which was the absolute bedrock of global trade at the time, was quietly going bankrupt.
Exactly. And that single terrifying visual of a foreign warship demanding payment, it triggered a massive panic, a panic that eventually forced 15 men to just lock themselves in a cabin in the Maryland mountains.
A secret summit. And the wild part is the decisions they made that weekend, they were really only supposed to take 15 minutes to announce on television.
Yeah, but instead, they completely permanently demolished the foundation of the global economy.
It is genuinely one of the most stunning pivots in modern history. You can literally draw a solid dividing line. There is the economic world before August 1971 and the economic world after it.
Those 15 men essentially rewrote the structural rules of money overnight.
They did. The rules of money, of geopolitical power, and of how every single nation on Earth interacts with one another. And this is the craziest part to me. They were basically flying blind.
Right, which is exactly what this deep dive is custom tailored to explore for you today. We're going to really unpack the mechanics of what historians call the Nixon Shock.
It's a fascinating term for a very chaotic weekend.
It really is. We're going to dig into how the United States intentionally broke the world's monetary system overnight. And how they somehow managed to pull off like the ultimate magic trick to stay at the very top of the financial food chain.
Which nobody expected they could actually do.
Exactly. And perhaps most importantly for you listening right now, we're going to look at whether we are watching that exact same foundation crack today in real time.
Because the data suggests we might be.
So, to help synthesize this massive stack of economic history, geopolitical analysis, and monetary theory we have today, I'm joined by our resident expert. Because honestly, to understand how money works today, you really have to understand how we broke it 50 years ago.
Exactly right. And to understand the sheer magnitude of the demolition job that happened in 1971, we actually need to rewind the clock a little bit further.
We have to set the stage.
Right. We need to look at the world that Richard Nixon actually inherited. So put yourself in July of 1944.
Okay, so World War II is still happening.
It is. The war is still raging across Europe and the Pacific. But, the writing is clearly on the wall. The Allied powers know they're going to win eventually.
Yeah, it's just a matter of time at that point.
Exactly. And the United States, which had miraculously escaped the sheer physical devastation that had just leveled the industrial bases of Europe and Asia, is looking ahead.
They're trying to figure out what the post-war global economy should actually look like when the dust settles.
Right, because nobody wanted a repeat of the 1930s.
Oh, absolutely not. When you look at the historical data, the memory of the Great Depression wasn't just like a sad historical story for these policymakers. It was a terrifying foundational trauma.
It really drove every decision they made.
It had to, because during the 1930s, the world was gripped by this extremely destructive phenomenon called competitive devaluations.
Yes, which analysts often describe as essentially economic trench warfare.
Right. Let's actually break that down for a second because it's so crucial to everything that comes next.
Go for it.
So imagine you have two countries, country A and country B. Country A realizes their economy is stalling out, so they intentionally drop the value of their own currency.
Making their exports cheaper.
Exactly. Suddenly, all the steel they produce is dirt cheap for the rest of the world to buy. It's this artificial discount. But over in country B, their steel industry starts dying because they just can't compete with those artificial prices.
Right, so country B has to respond.
Yeah. So what do? They drop their currency even lower. And it becomes this vicious retaliatory race to the bottom where everyone's savings just get wiped out.
Global trade completely freezes up.
And all it does is fuel the extreme political radicalization that directly led to World War II in the first place.
So to ensure that exact nightmare never happens again, representatives from 44 nations gathered in a small, really quiet resort town called Bretton in New Hampshire.
44 nations in one hotel, essentially.
Yeah, and their explicit mission was to design a financial architecture that would make that kind of currency warfare mathematically impossible.
They wanted to lock the system down.
Exactly. And the solution they engineered was defined by its really elegant, rigid simplicity. They essentially built a pyramid of stability.
Okay, a pyramid. Break that down.
Well, at the very top of this pyramid was physical gold. The United States dollar would be legally pegged to gold at a fixed, completely unchangeable rate of exactly $35 per ounce.
$35. Fixed. No
Yeah.
exceptions.
No exceptions. Then, every other currency in the world, like the British pound, the French franc, the Japanese yen, would be pegged not to gold, but to the US dollar.
Oh, wow. Okay, so the dollar anchors the entire world, and the gold anchors the dollar.
Precisely. The whole system relied on this ironclad guarantee. If a foreign central bank ever doubted the value of the paper dollars they were holding, they had the absolute legal right to walk right up to the American Treasury window.
And just hand them over.
Yep. They could exchange those paper dollars for physical gold bars at that strict $35 rate. The dollar was, quite literally, as good as gold.
And in 1944, no one questioned this promise, right? Because the United States held roughly 2/3 of all the monetary gold on planet Earth at that point.
It was a staggering amount of wealth. They had hoarded it through decades of massive trade surpluses. Plus, European nations had been draining their own vaults to pay for American weapons and supplies before the U.S. officially entered the war.
Right, so the vault was full. And for a couple of decades, this Bretton Woods system worked like an absolute dream, didn't it?
It really did. The post-war era saw this unprecedented global economic miracle.
You had the Marshall Plan, right? Where the U.S. systematically pumped billions of dollars into rebuilding a war-shattered Europe and Asia.
Yeah, and those American dollars funded West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, their rapid economic wonder. And they provided the crucial capital that transformed Japan from a bombed-out nation into a towering, high-tech industrial powerhouse.
But this is where we have to look at the underlying mechanics, because the sources point out that the very mechanism that made this global rebuild so successful actually contained a fatal, unavoidable mathematical flaw.
Yeah, it was a ticking time bomb. And a Belgian-born Yale economist named Robert Triffin, he actually saw it coming a mile away as early as 1960.
He called it out way before anyone else.
He did. He identified an economic paradox that we now call the Triffin dilemma. He pointed out that to keep this incredible post-war global economy growing, the world desperately needed a constant, massive supply of U.S. dollars.
So they needed them to trade, right?
Exactly. Countries needed dollars to trade with one another, to build up their central bank safety nets, and to settle basically all international invoices.
Okay, let's unpack this mechanism, because this is really the root of the whole crisis. If the entire world needs your specific currency to function, you, meaning the United States, you have to supply it.
You have to push it out into the system.
Right. But how does a country physically supply its money to the rest of the world? You have to spend more than you earn.
Yes.
You literally have to buy more things from other countries than you sell to them. You have to run persistent trade deficits to physically pump those paper dollars out into the global economy.
Exactly. And here is the brutal dilemma that Triffin pointed out. The more paper dollars the United States pumped out into the world to keep global trade humming, the less physical gold it held relative to those outstanding dollars.
The ratio gets completely out of whack.
Right. The ratio between paper and gold was falling rapidly. And as that ratio plummeted, the core foundational promise of the entire Bretton Woods system became less and less mathematically credible.
The promise that you could always trade your dollars for gold at $35 an ounce.
Exactly. The system structurally required the United States to weaken its own financial backing in order to keep the world economy functioning.
It sounds like a bartender who has to keep handing out endless IOU tabs to keep a massive party going. But everyone in the bar slowly realizes there is nowhere near enough liquor in the back room to actually cover all those tabs if everyone tries to cash them in at once.
That is a perfect analogy. That's exactly what was happening.
But if Robert Triffin was warning everybody about this mathematical reality in 1960, why did no one in Washington hit the brakes?
Well, because hitting the brakes would mean abruptly stopping the flow of dollars out into the world. And doing that would instantly trigger a massive global recession, or quite possibly a depression.
And no politician wants to be responsible for that.
Nobody, anywhere, wants to be the one to intentionally crash the global economy on their watch. So they chose to kick the can down the road.
As politicians often do.
Always. And then the political pressures of the 1960s accelerated the timeline dramatically. You had the escalation of the Vietnam War, which was just violently draining the American treasury.
Yeah, wars are never cheap.
No. And simultaneously, you had President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs. These were massive, unprecedented domestic spending initiatives for healthcare and poverty reduction.
So they're spending heavily overseas and at home at the exact same time.
Exactly. The U.S. government was spending money it didn't have at an astonishing rate. Dollars were flooding out of America so fast that the gold reserves sitting in Fort Knox simply could not mathematically back them anymore.
So by the late 1960s, that $35 peg wasn't just strained, it was basically a total fiction.
It was an illusion, and the Europeans, they weren't stupid. They knew it was a fiction.
Right. I mean, French President Charles de Gaulle was famously brutally blunt about it.
He was. And his finance minister, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, actually coined a phrase that perfectly captures the resentment. And we still use this phrase today. He called America's reserve currency status an exorbitant privilege.
Exorbitant privilege.
Yeah, he argued that because the world was structurally forced to use dollars, America didn't have to play by the normal economic rules.
They could just, like, print paper money out of thin air to finance their overseas wars and run massive deficits.
Exactly. And by doing that, they were essentially exporting their inflation to everybody else.
Which brings us back to that warship from the intro. France decided they weren't going to play along with the fiction anymore. They decided to actually call the bluff.
They did. They began systematically, aggressively converting their massive dollar holdings into physical gold at that official $35 rate.
They're just draining the American vaults.
It was, in technical terms, a quiet run on the global bank. And once France started doing it, the panic became contagious.
Because nobody wants to be the last one holding the worthless paper.
Exactly. They weren't alone. By May of 1971, West Germany looked at the situation and decided to just leave the Bretton Woods system entirely, rather than keep absorbing these increasingly worthless paper dollars.
Wow. Germany just bails.
Yep. And Switzerland followed right behind them in August.
So the whole system is just unraveling in real time. And then comes the absolute breaking point. France actually dispatches a literal naval warship to New York Harbor to physically collect and transport their gold deposits.
It's just an insane visual.
Can you imagine a foreign allied warship showing up in New York to haul away physical bullion because they fundamentally do not trust the integrity of your money anymore?
And while that's happening, Britain sends an urgent diplomatic cable demanding $3 billion of their holdings be immediately converted to gold.
$3 billion. The vault is just emptying.
It is. The run on the bank is no longer quiet, it is undeniable, and it is accelerating fast.
Which perfectly sets the stage for that secret summit we mentioned. Friday, the 13th of August, 1971. President Nixon knows the game is up.
He knows he has to do something drastic.
So he quietly convenes his 15 most senior economic advisors at Camp David in the Maryland mountains. We're talking about absolute heavyweights here.
Yeah, you had Treasury Secretary John Connally, Budget Director George Shultz, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns,
And a young, incredibly sharp undersecretary named Paul Volcker, right?
Yes, Volcker was there too. And the paranoia and secrecy surrounding this meeting were absolute. These men were instructed not to even tell their own wives where they were going or what they were doing.
That's intense.
It was. The White House press corps was fed a completely fabricated cover story about the president reviewing defense spending.
Okay, so you have 15 of the most powerful financial minds on Earth locked away in a mountain cabin for 3 days. The global economy is literally collapsing outside the gates. What were they actually debating in there?
They were trying to figure out how to stop a run on a bank when the bank is the United States government. And they mapped out 3 very stark, very painful options.
Let's hear them.
Okay, option 1 was to play by the rules and defend the gold peg. But doing that would require draconian measures.
Like what?
They would have to drastically slash government spending, aggressively hike interest rates to the moon, and purposefully engineer a severe domestic recession.
Just to pull dollars back into the country and stabilize the gold ratio?
Exactly. It would have been brutal for everyday Americans. So option 2 was to act multilaterally, to negotiate openly with all their international trading partners, devalue the dollar slowly, and redesign the system together.
That sounds reasonable, though.
It sounds reasonable, but it would be a slow, unbelievably messy, and internationally humiliating process. It would make the U.S. look incredibly weak on the global stage.
Right, and during the Cold War, you don't want to look weak. So what was the third option?
Option 3 was heavily advocated by the incredibly tough-talking Treasury Secretary from Texas, John Connally. His plan was to act unilaterally.
Just do it alone.
Yeah. Close the gold window immediately, shock the entire world without warning, and let the chips fall where they may.
And Nixon is staring down a presidential election in 1972 at this point. There is absolutely no universe in which Richard Nixon intentionally triggers a severe domestic recession right before he asks the American public to re-elect him.
Definitely not. So he goes with option 3.
On Sunday evening, August 15th, 1971, Nixon preempts primetime television. Families are sitting down to watch Bonanza, and suddenly the president is on the screen.
Yeah, interrupting their Sunday night.
And in a tight 15-minute speech, he announces 3 massive unilateral changes to the economy.
First, he announces a 90-day freeze on all wages and prices across the entire United States.
Which is wild to think about today. The
Yeah.
government just capping pricing.
It is wild. Second, he announces a sweeping 10% surcharge on all foreign imports.
A massive tariff, basically.
Exactly. And third, and this is the absolute kill shot, he orders the Secretary of the Treasury to immediately suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold.
He just severs the tie.
Yeah.
Just like that.
He did. And what is absolutely vital to understand about this moment is the deceptive framing. Nixon presented this to the American public as a temporary emergency measure.
Right. He framed it as protecting the dollar against malicious international speculators.
Yes. And politically, it worked brilliantly in the short term. The wage and price freeze was incredibly popular at home because everyday Americans were just sick and tired of inflation eating their paychecks.
And the import surcharge probably felt like a strong patriotic stand to protect American factory workers.
It did. But the reality which the global financial markets understood instantly was that the foundational architecture of global finance had just been completely demolished.
Wait, hold on. I really have to put myself in the shoes of an allied nation here. You're telling me Nixon just went on TV, blew up the bedrock of global trade that everyone had relied on since World War II, and the rest of the world just took it?
Whoa.
Why didn't Europe band together and immediately sanction the U.S.? They must have been furious.
Oh, they were in a state of absolute stunned fury. Imagine you are the finance minister of Japan or Italy. You have built your entire national economy, your central bank reserves, and your export models around the ironclad rules of Bretton Woods.
And the U.S. just deletes the rule book overnight without even a courtesy phone call.
Exactly. But the core problem was they had no real leverage. Europe was furious, but they were still heavily dependent on the U.S. military umbrella for protection against the Soviet Union.
Ah, right, the Cold War dynamic.
Yeah. And Treasury Secretary Connolly's diplomatic approach to their anger was essentially a sledgehammer.
What did he say?
When European leaders complained to him about the shock, he famously told them right to their faces, "It is our currency, but it is your problem."
Our currency, but your problem. That is, wow, that is chillingly arrogant.
It's incredibly blunt.
But I guess it was completely accurate. Because after 1971, we tried a few half-hearted band-aids, right?
Mm-hmm.
The sources mentioned the Smithsonian Agreement tried to set new fixed rates, but it failed miserably.
It did. It couldn't hold.
So by 1973, the world just kind of gave up. Currencies were allowed to float freely against each other, and their values were determined purely by chaotic market forces.
Yes, the era of floating fiat currencies had officially begun.
But this is where the story really doesn't make logical sense to me. Imagine waking up to find out the only reason people trusted your money, the gold backing, is completely gone.
Right.
You would think the U.S. dollar would just collapse into irrelevance. If the fundamental guarantee of the dollar is broken, why would anyone continue to hold it?
It's a great point.
How on earth did the United States get away with completely demolishing the global financial system without losing its spot at the very top of the financial food chain?
That is the most pivotal question of the late 20th century. Because the logical expectation, what most classical economists predicted would happen, was exactly what you just said. They predicted that the dollar's dominance would rapidly fade and the U.S. would suffer a massive decline in living standards.
But that's not what happened.
No, because the survival of the dollar ultimately wasn't about gold anymore. It was about finding a new anchor, a new reason for the world to desperately need U.S. currency.
Okay, so what was the new anchor?
Well, the incredibly brilliant, albeit entirely ruthless minds of the Nixon administration, particularly his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, they found that new anchor in the most unlikely of places, a geopolitical crisis in the Middle East.
Okay, enter the October 1973 oil embargo.
Exactly.
This was the retaliation by Arab members of OPEC against the United States for supporting Israel during the Yom Kippur War. They cut off the supply, And the price of oil basically quadrupled almost overnight.
It was a massive shock to the global system.
Right. Now, we've all heard the stories about the domestic impact in America. The massive lines at the gas stations, the rationing, the panic.
Everyone remembers the gas lines.
Yeah. But the sources point out we rarely talk about the flip side of that equation. For OPEC countries, and specifically Saudi Arabia, that quadrupled price created an absolute tsunami of cash.
It was a scale of wealth transfer that was almost unprecedented in human history. These oil-producing nations were suddenly sitting on cash surpluses so massive that their domestic economies couldn't even physically absorb the money.
I mean, you can only build so many palaces and highways.
Exactly. They had a desperate need for a highly secure, incredibly deep financial infrastructure to park hundreds of billions of dollars. And simultaneously, they had an existential need for absolute military security in what was rapidly becoming the most volatile geopolitical region on the planet.
And Henry Kissinger looked at this landscape and realized that the United States was the only country uniquely positioned to provide both of those things at the exact same time.
He saw an opportunity.
And this leads to what has to be one of the most masterful, consequential geopolitical pivots in modern history. In 1974, Kissinger actually travels to Saudi Arabia and negotiates a covert three-part deal with the Saudi royal family.
This is the real bedrock of today's economy.
Let's break this down because it's so important. Part 1. Saudi Arabia agrees to price all of its global oil sales exclusively in U.S. dollars. No exceptions.
Right. If Japan or France wants Saudi oil, they have to buy it with American dollars.
Part 2. The Saudis agreed to take their massive surplus oil revenues, what the financial world started calling petrodollars, and invest them directly into U.S. Treasury bonds.
Funding the American debt.
Yes. And Part 3. In exchange for pricing in dollars and funding the U.S. debt, the United States guarantees military protection for Saudi Arabia, protects its oil fields, and sells them the most advanced weaponry in the American arsenal.
And the real kicker is by 1975, every single other member of OPEC had agreed to this exact same arrangement.
So they all fell in line.
They did. The structural genius of what Kissinger called petrodollar recycling is staggering when you really map out the mechanics of it.
Think of it as a closed loop, right?
Exactly. The U.S. buys oil from Saudi Arabia and hands over paper dollars. Saudi Arabia now has billions of excess dollars, so they loan those dollars back to the U.S. government by buying treasury bonds.
And then the U.S. government uses that loaned money to fund the very military that is deployed to protect the Saudi oil fields.
It is a brilliant, completely self-sustaining financial ecosystem. Under the old Bretton Woods system, the world needed dollars because they were a claim on a shiny metal. Now, the world needed dollars because it was literally the only way to buy the energy required to keep their lights on and their factories running.
Wow. And since every modern economy runs on oil, every country in the world still desperately needed dollars.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. It's like we pulled off a massive global bait and switch. We transitioned from a gold standard directly into a security standard.
A security standard. I like that.
Yeah, we stopped backing our money with physical metal that we actually had to dig out of the ground, and we started backing it with aircraft carriers, fighter jets, and military alliances. It's infinitely more flexible.
Because you can't print gold, but you can project military power anywhere.
Exactly.
It was brilliantly flexible, but more importantly, it handed the United States an incredibly potent, brand new geopolitical weapon.
The weaponization of finance.
Right. Because the entire global energy trade was now exclusively denominated in dollars and physically settled through U.S.-linked banking plumbing, the U.S. gained the unprecedented ability to impose devastating financial sanctions on its enemies.
Just cut them off from the plumbing.
Exactly. By simply cutting a rogue nation off from dollar-denominated trade, by freezing them out of the clearinghouses in New York, Washington could effectively excommunicate an entire country from the modern global economy without firing a single shot.
That is immense power. But the analysis shows that this brilliant geopolitical maneuver did not come for free. It created a massive, slow-burning domestic hangover that is at the root of some of our most bitter political divides today.
It did.
Which brings us to what economists now call the exorbitant duty.
Yes. And to understand the duty, we first really have to quantify the sheer scale of the dollar's dominance today. Because we're not in the 1970s anymore. Fast forward to 2024.
The numbers are crazy.
They are. The US dollar is on one side of almost 90% of all foreign exchange transactions globally. It makes up roughly 58% of all central bank foreign exchange reserves worldwide.
Almost everything is priced in dollars.
Almost all major commodities: oil, gold, wheat, copper. If a manufacturing company in Malaysia wants to buy microchips from South Korea, they don't use Malaysian ringgit or Korean won. They settle that invoice in US dollars.
So the global demand for the dollar is structural, massive, and just permanent,
Yes.
which gives the U.S. that famous exorbitant privilege we talked about. We can borrow money far cheaper than any other nation. We can run massive multi-trillion-dollar trade deficits without our currency collapsing. And we can fund a military budget larger than the next 10 countries combined.
All because the rest of the world is structurally forced to buy our debt to facilitate their own trade.
Right. But there is a hidden cost here. Economists Pierre-Olivier Garinches and Helene Ray actually coined this concept of the exorbitant duty.
And the trade-off is profound and mathematically unavoidable. If the entire world requires a constant, massive supply of dollars to function, the United States must continually pump those dollars out.
We're back to Triffin's dilemma.
Exactly. As we discussed earlier, the only way to pump those dollars out is to be the global consumer of last resort. The U.S. must continually buy more goods from the rest of the world than it sells to them.
It has to absorb foreign exports.
Right. But when a country is structurally forced to perpetually import more than it exports, it mathematically requires a hollowing out of its domestic manufacturing sector.
And this is where it hits close to home. Why should you, the listener, care about obscure terms like reserve currency statuses? Because it is the invisible hand that dictates exactly where factories are built, which towns thrive, and who gets to borrow money cheaply.
It impacts everyday life.
It really does. The macroeconomic data draws a direct, unavoidable line between this global monetary plumbing and the creation of the American Rust Belt.
It's cause and effect.
When the U.S. dollar is artificially strong because everyone globally needs it, American-made goods become too expensive to sell overseas, while foreign-made goods become incredibly cheap for Americans to buy.
The math just works against domestic production.
Right. So factories in Ohio and Michigan close down because they literally can't compete with the currency dynamics, and those jobs move to Mexico or Asia.
The massive manufacturing job losses across the American Midwest over the last 40 years laid the direct structural groundwork for the intense economic nationalism and the rise of populism we see today.
It's not just politics. Analysts point out it's a direct cause and effect of functioning as the world's reserve currency. You have to sacrifice your manufacturing base.
Which requires us to take a very hard analytical look at the stability of this entire system right now. Nixon and Kissinger hastily built this architecture 50 years ago in a moment of sheer crisis.
Just slap it on Band-Aids.
Yeah. But a monetary system that is held together merely by habit, institutional inertia, and the threat of military leverage is not invincible. And history shows us that when these systems fail, they tend to fail spectacularly.
Right, which brings us to the present day. If this system relies purely on institutional momentum, where are the cracks actually starting to show? Because when you dig into the data provided in the sources, you see a very clear, unusually rapid erosion of the dollar's market share over the last 20 years.
The statistics are entirely undeniable at this point. In 1999, the dollar represented about 71% of all global foreign exchange reserves, but by 2022, that dominance had fallen to roughly 58%.
Now, to a layperson, dropping from 71 to 58 over 2 decades might sound like a pretty slow, modest decline.
Sure, but in the ultra-conservative glacial world of central banking, that is a massive tectonic structural shift. Trillions of dollars of wealth have quietly moved out of the U.S. system.
And the analysis points to 4 primary intersecting drivers causing this acceleration, right? Let's break down how these drivers actually work in the real world.
Let's do it.
The first driver is the weaponization of money. In February 2022, immediately after Russia invaded Ukraine, the U.S. and its European allies took an unprecedented step. They froze $300 billion of the Russian central bank's foreign exchange reserves.
The psychological impact of this event on global finance absolutely cannot be overstated. We really need to understand what a reserve actually is in this context.
Okay, unpack that.
Those $300 billion weren't physical pallets of cash sitting in a Moscow vault. They were digital ledger entries held at Western institutions, primarily the Federal Reserve in New York.
Right, because it's the global plumbing.
Exactly. Russia had accumulated that wealth over decades by selling oil and gas, precisely to build a financial fortress to protect their economy from shocks. But when Washington and its allies froze those assets with the stroke of a pen, they deleted a sovereign nation's savings account overnight.
Just hit delete.
It sent a chilling, immediate message across the globe. Central banks in places like Saudi Arabia, China, and India watched that happen and suddenly realized that holding their national wealth in US dollars was no longer a safe, neutral financial decision. It was a massive geopolitical liability.
Think about that from their perspective.
Yeah.
If I am the head of a foreign central bank, I'm suddenly realizing that my country's entire life savings are only actually mine as long as Washington agrees with my foreign policy.
Exactly right.
If I step out of line, they can just hit delete on my national wealth. No wonder they are frantically looking for the exits.
Which directly accelerates the second driver the sources mention.
Yeah.
The rise of China's alternative financial architecture.
Because China is definitely watching this happen.
Oh, Beijing watched the Russian asset freeze and recognized the vulnerability immediately. While the Chinese yuan only makes up about 2% of global reserves right now, Beijing isn't focusing on the currency itself. They are systematically building alternative plumbing.
The rails to move the money.
Exactly. The Western world relies on SWIFT, the messaging network that banks use to securely authorize international money transfers. So China created the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or CIPS, as a direct competitor.
And how's that going for them?
Well, by early 2025, CIPS had grown to include 119 countries. Furthermore, China and Russia are now conducting the vast majority of their massive bilateral trade entirely in yuan and rubles. They are completely bypassing the dollar ecosystem.
Just sidestepping it entirely.
Okay.
And that panic over weaponization fuels the third driver, which is the massive expansion of the BRICS coalition.
BRICS is a fascinating evolution.
It really is.
Mhm.
What started 20 years ago as literally just a catchy acronym coined by a Goldman Sachs analyst for emerging markets, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, has morphed into a highly serious geopolitical bloc actively seeking independence from the West.
They're organizing?
At the 2024 summit in Kazan, Russia, they didn't just meet, they expanded. They officially added Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE. In 2025, Indonesia joined the ranks.
And they are actively developing BRICS Pay, which is a decentralized blockchain-based system designed specifically to allow these nations to trade with each other in their own local currencies.
Rendering the dollar entirely unnecessary for their internal commerce.
Exactly. And we must impartially include the fourth driver, which is the fiscal behavior of the United States itself. We are currently looking at a U.S. national debt exceeding $36 trillion.
36 trillion.
You have persistent, massive annual deficits regardless of which political party is in power, recurrent debt ceiling crises that threaten technical default, and a deep structural political dysfunction in Washington.
Right. And ultimately, fiat money not backed by physical commodities, rests fundamentally on trust.
It's all about trust.
Every time the U.S. political system appears chaotic, or every time it weaponizes its currency, it chips away at the foundational trust required to maintain a global reserve status.
But, and this is a crucial but, wanting to escape the dollar and actually building the lifeboat to do it are two entirely different tasks.
Yes. And this is where we have to balance the narrative. Because when you actually look at the mechanics of de-dollarization, you quickly realize why the dollar is so incredibly hard to kill.
It's incredibly resilient. The primary moat protecting the dollar is the concept of network effects.
Network effects. Let's unpack that for everyone.
It's vital to understand that the dollar isn't just a piece of paper. It is the underlying invisible plumbing of global finance. Every major financial pricing model, every international banking software system, and every commodities trading platform on Earth is built to run on dollars.
It's a great concept to break down. Trying to replace the US dollar isn't like switching your cell phone carrier where you just swap a SIM card and you're done.
Not at all.
It's much more like trying to convince the entire world to stop speaking English in global aviation overnight.
Yeah.
You can invent a mathematically superior, perfectly logical new language, but if the air traffic controllers in Tokyo, the pilots in Brazil, and the ground crew in Frankfurt don't already speak it fluently, the planes are going to crash.
That's exactly it. The switching costs are astronomically high. Even countries that are vehemently ideologically opposed to U.S. hegemony often find themselves reluctantly using dollars to settle transactions simply because it is the most liquid, universally accepted, and reliable instrument available.
Case in point. Despite all the anti-dollar rhetoric coming out of the BRICS summits, as of January 2025, the U.S. dollar still accounted for roughly 50% of all SWIFT transactions globally.
It's still the king. And when you evaluate the actual alternatives, they all have massive, glaring structural flaws.
Let's talk about the euro, for instance.
Well, the euro is the second most used currency, but the European Union is politically fragmented. Unlike the United States, which has a massive singular treasury bond market where countries can safely park trillions of dollars, Europe has fractured sovereign debt.
Right. German bonds are very different from Italian bonds.
Exactly. It lacks the cohesive depth of the U.S. market. Then you have the Chinese yuan. The fundamental problem there is the trilemma of international finance.
Okay, explain this, because it's a massive roadblock for China. I don't really get how China can seriously pitch the yuan as a global reserve currency if they won't even let their own citizens move money freely.
It's exactly that. China maintains incredibly strict capital controls. The Chinese Communist Party prioritizes absolute domestic economic stability and control above all else.
They want to control the flow.
That means if a foreign corporation or a wealthy individual wants to pull billions of dollars out of Shanghai and move it to London, the state can, and often does, simply say no. The flow of money is highly restricted.
So if you are a foreign central bank, you are absolutely not going to store your nation's sovereign wealth in a currency that you cannot legally and instantly liquidate whenever you want.
Precisely. You can't be the global reserve if the world isn't 100% sure they can easily get their money out of your borders.
And this structural lock-in gives the U.S. immense leverage, which we saw deployed aggressively in late 2024. Donald Trump issued an explicit public threat. He promised to slap 100% tariffs on the exports of any BRICS country that attempted to create or formally back an alternative reserve currency.
And the reaction from the BRICS nations was staggering. It was almost immediate capitulation.
They folded immediately.
Vladimir Putin publicly admitted that Russia wouldn't be abandoning the dollar anytime soon. Brazil's President Lula quietly dropped his impassioned speeches about a common currency. India firmly and publicly denied ever having a desire for de-dollarization in the first place.
And by the time the July 2025 BRICS summit in Rio rolled around, the final joint declaration didn't contain a single mention of a common currency strategy.
So the empire strikes back, essentially using its market access as a club. But we really have to look past the immediate victory here. The fact that Washington felt the political need to issue a formal, aggressive 100% tariff warning proves that the underlying pressure is absolutely real. The alternative currency might not be ready to deploy today, but the desire among the global south to escape the dollar's gravity is growing exponentially.
So if the dam is slowly cracking, but the obvious lifeboats all have holes in them, what actually happens next? We have to look at historical precedent to see how currency empires actually fall.
We do. And when you compare the macroeconomic climate of 1971 to the 2020s, the parallels are deeply, deeply unsettling.
They really are. In 1971, you had a U.S. government running completely unsustainable deficits driven by overseas military spending and massive domestic entitlement programs.
Check.
You had intense geopolitical competition. Check. You had allied trading partners openly questioning the long-term security of their dollar holdings.
Check again. Every single one of those structural factors is present today, arguably in greater force.
So what are the actual candidates to replace the petrodollar if the system begins to unwind? The analysis points to a few distinct scenarios.
The first is a multipolar system, where the US dollar, the euro, and the yuan all share the load, carving the world into regional financial blocks.
But history shows that multipolar currency systems are incredibly unstable, right?
It's very unstable. Just look at the chaotic period in the 1920s and 30s when the rising US dollar and the declining British sterling shared global power. It was defined by extreme volatility.
Then there's the idea of a unified BRICS currency. But as we just discussed, their internal interests are wildly conflicting. India and China have massive, occasionally violent border disputes. They are absolutely not going to share a unified central bank or monetary policy.
No chance. Finally, there are sovereign digital currencies, like China's mBridge blockchain project. A system like that brilliantly solves the technical plumbing issues of moving money without SWIFT, but technology doesn't solve the core issue of political trust.
And that profound lack of trust across the board leads us to what is easily the most fascinating, stealthy development in the global monetary system right now: the massive, historic comeback of physical gold.
Oh, this is so important.
Over the last few years, central banks around the world have been quietly buying up gold at a staggering pace. They added over 1,000 metric tons to their sovereign reserves in 2023, and then they did it again in 2024.
Just hoarding it.
As a result, gold's share of global foreign reserves skyrocketed from around 13% in 2017 to roughly 30% by late 2025.
And to understand why this is happening, you have to look at the psychology of a central banker in a multipolar world.
Right. So what does this actually mean in practice? Buying gold is basically the macroeconomic equivalent of stuffing cash in your mattress.
Exactly.
Think about it. Central banks aren't backing up the truck for gold because it yields a great interest rate or pays a quarterly dividend. It pays nothing.
Zero yield.
They are buying it because a physical bar of gold sitting deep in a vault inside your own sovereign territory cannot be frozen by a foreign government's executive order.
It cannot be hacked by a cyber attack on SWIFT.
Exactly. It cannot be sanctioned. It requires no counterparty trust. It is the ultimate primitive hedge against a digital, interconnected financial system that you no longer fully trust.
And to understand the terrifying reality of how these transitions play out when trust finally evaporates, we really have to look at the decline of the British sterling.
The previous reserve currency.
Exactly. Before the US dollar, the British pound sterling was the undisputed global reserve currency anchored by the vast reach of the British Empire. But its decline was not a polite boardroom negotiation where gentlemen shook hands and transferred power.
No, it rarely is.
It was a violent unraveling forced by the devastating financial costs of fighting 2 consecutive world wars, the accumulation of absolutely unpayable massive sovereign debt, and the rapid decolonization of the empire.
And the end of Sterling's reign wasn't just a slow fade either. The analysis highlights that it ended with a very specific, brutal punctuation mark.
Yes, the 1956 Suez Crisis.
Break that down for us.
Well, Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt to retake control of the Suez Canal. The United States, absolutely furious at the disruption, decided to end the war not with troops, but with money.
They used their financial leverage.
They did. Washington essentially threatened to dump its massive holdings of British sterling onto the open market, which would have instantly crashed the British economy.
And Britain just had to fold.
They did. Britain was forced into a humiliating, immediate military withdrawal. That was the moment, the exact day, that laid bare the stark reality that Britain no longer possessed the financial independence or the military power to enforce its economic will on the world.
A total shift in power.
Reserve currency transitions are notoriously violent and chaotic. The historical pattern is that global confidence erodes slowly, almost imperceptibly, for decades. And then, triggered by a seemingly isolated geopolitical shock, the system collapses suddenly in a Suez moment.
So if the foundation is cracking, how do we know when the dam is actually about to break? Based on the economic models and historical patterns we've discussed from the sources, there are 4 very specific real-world warning signs that you should be watching closely over the next few years.
Let's lay out the checklist.
That was good.
Number 1, watch Saudi Arabia. The entire petrodollar security standard began with them, and it will likely end with them. The crucial metric is whether they begin systematically selling large volumes of oil in non-dollar currencies.
And they have been fin-straddling brilliantly lately. In 2023, they publicly stated they were open to non-dollar trades, which sent total shockwaves through the markets.
They know exactly what they're doing.
But then, in November 2025, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman announced a massive $1 trillion investment directly into the U.S. economy. They are expertly playing both sides of the geopolitical divide to maximize their leverage.
But if they ever definitively pivot away from pricing their core commodity in dollars, that is the ultimate alarm bell.
Number 2 on the checklist. Watch the gold purchases. Pay close attention to the World Gold Council reports.
Good metric.
If foreign central banks continue to buy physical gold at these record-shattering, multi-thousand-ton levels, it is a clear, undeniable indicator that the smartest, most conservative financial minds on Earth are systematically and purposefully diversifying their nations away from U.S. dollar risk.
Number 3. Watch China's capital account. As we discussed earlier, the yuan cannot challenge the dollar while it is locked down.
The trilemma.
Exactly. But if Beijing ever decides to bite the bullet, prioritize global financial hegemony over strict domestic control, and actually allow the free, unrestricted movement of money in and out of China, the calculus changes entirely.
That'd be a huge shift.
It would. In that scenario, the yuan instantly transforms from a theoretical, flawed alternative into a true, formidable, highly liquid threat to the dollar overnight.
And number 4, watch U.S. fiscal policy. The ghost of Robert Triffin is still haunting Washington right now.
Yep.
You need to watch the debt-to-GDP ratio.
The math doesn't lie.
If U.S. deficits reach a point where the rest of the world fundamentally doubts that America can mathematically service its $36 trillion debt without simply instructing the Federal Reserve to print massive amounts of money to inflate it away, the foundation cracks entirely.
There is a mathematical limit to the exorbitant privilege, and it is defined entirely by the bond market's willingness to keep buying the debt.
The overarching lesson of this entire historical deep dive is really about the chaotic nature of crisis management.
That's a great way to summarize it.
When Nixon and Kissinger retreated to Camp David, they did not have a grand 50-year blueprint for a global fiat monetary architecture. They were just politicians trying to survive an immediate, brutal political nightmare, a collapsing gold ratio, and an acute oil crisis.
They were just applying tourniquets to stop the bleeding.
And that unintended consequence is the perfect point to leave you with today. The entire financial system that has dictated global wealth, defined international relations, and shaped the American economy for the last 50 years was accidentally born out of a temporary 15-minute emergency measure.
Just a Band-Aid.
It was just supposed to be a Band-Aid. So look around at the world right now. Look at the emergency measures governments are taking today in the name of immediate crisis management. Whether it's unprecedented emergency tech regulations, the rapid, untested rollout of massive digital infrastructure, or the extraordinary multi-trillion-dollar steps being taken to manage national debts. What temporary Band-Aids are being applied right now that might secretly be writing the rigid, inescapable rules for the next half-century of your life?